Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to walk you through in detail how carbon dioxide gases get transported outside of our body, right? We all know that the last step of getting rid of carbon dioxide is through exhalation by the lungs, right? But how does your body transport the carbon dioxide gases from the tissues all over your body to the lungs for exhalation? Right? Before we dive into this really quickly, I want to connect all the dots, all the MCAT topics. So I want to ask you, why do tissues produce CO2 from the first place? As you may imagine, because of the two stages of cellular respiration that produces CO2, right? What are the two stages that produce CO2? You might remember citric acid cycle, right? Or Krebs cycle. But there's also a stage between glycolysis and citric acid cycle that the end product of glycolysis is pyruvate, right? That needs to get oxidized and decarboxylated into acetyl-CoA, which is the starting material of citric acid cycle, right? And then this is done in pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, right? Remember? And then this intermediate step between glycolysis and citric acid cycle produces CO2 as well, okay? Not just citric acid cycle. All right, now back to today's topic. Excuse me for my elaboration. I just want to connect all the dots together. All right, so back to our topic today. When blood cells finish picking up CO2, which again is the waste products of cellular respiration, and at the same time, blood finish dropping off the fresh oxygen to your tissues, right? And now the very same blood, they gotta take these carbon dioxide rich blood back to the lungs throughout the vein for a new round of CO2 and oxygen exchange in the alveoli of your lungs, right? How is that done? Does CO2 just sit quietly in the blood? The answer is no, as you imagine, right? Most of them don't. Only about 7% of the CO2 does that. They just dissolve in the plasma and they sit quietly until they end their journey to the lungs and eventually outside of your body to the real beautiful world, right? But most of the CO2, 70% of the CO2 gases, they don't want to sit quietly in your blood. They're the anti ones that either want to react with water or ride with hemoglobin for their journeys to the lungs, okay? So we're first going to talk about the CO2 gases that react with water first, okay? As you may have seen this equation called biological buffer. You may have seen this equation at least 4 or 5 times in your science courses, right? And then I love this equation, but I really don't like how this was taught by our professors in college and also a lot of the MCAT tutorials that I encountered. I don't like the way that they just throw this equation at you, tells you, hey, see, that's what that's what carbon dioxide does. It reacts with water. And then the enzyme carbonic anhydrase would catalyze the reaction. We form carbonic acid. And then it's a reverse reaction. And then the carbonic acid would also it's an acid, right? It will break into carbonate and then proton. And then this is also reverse. That's all they tell you. And then you're like so confused. So what, right? So today I'm going to hold your hand, babysit you, talk you step by step how this carbon dioxide reacts with water and gets to your lung and then eventually gets exhaled, okay? So I want to show you a picture that I drew, and also I break down this equation into 2 equations. Okay, equation A and B, okay? As you see, the equation A is the forward reaction, how carbon dioxide, water, they form the carbonic acid, okay? And then they break down into bicarbonate and then proton, okay? And then reaction B is the reversed one, how the bicarbonate and proton, they reform the carbonic acid. And then also again, with the help of a carbonic anhydrase, Ca here, I reform CO2 and water, okay? So as you can see, A and B, they're the same equation. You see that on your textbook, but I broke it down for a reason, okay? For what reason? Let's walk you through, okay? So first, you see your tissue, right? Can be whatever tissue, your intestine tissue, your heart tissue, okay, whatever tissue in your body, then I need to pick up the CO2, right, the waste products due to the cellular respiration once again. And then okay, this is my blood vessel, okay? This is my blood vessel. And then in my blood vessel, I have a red blood cell, okay? And then in red blood cell, I have this enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, okay? So basically, the CO2 will get inside your red blood cell. And then the Ca, the carbonic anhydrase, would catalyze the reaction of CO2 plus water, okay? Form carbonic acid. Okay, and then carbonic acid, as we know, okay, dissociates. So then we have bicarbonate and the proton in your red blood cell. Okay, this all happens in your red blood cell. Okay, not anywhere else in your blood, because the enzyme carbonic anhydrase is in your red blood cell. Okay, red blood cell is a part of your blood, right? Okay, and then there's also other parts in your blood that are plasma, okay, or white blood cell, which is a different topic. But anyways, let's focus on the plasma and red blood cell, okay? So once in my red blood cell, the bicarbonate is formed. The bicarbonate doesn't stay in the red blood cell. It will go to those I indicated with the yellow highlighted is your plasma, okay? It will dissolve in the plasma. And then eventually the blood travels to your lung. Okay, when the blood travels to your lung, then the reaction B happens, okay? These bicarbonate will, with the protons, they form carbonic acid. And then eventually, with the help of Ca in your lung, in your blood cell, they form CO2. And then CO2 can be exhaled, okay? That is the path that they never taught us on any textbook, or I figured out by myself. I never learned this from anyone, so I don't know why they don't teach us this way, okay? But they just throw at us this equation. Oh wow, so a lot of students memorize it, but do you really understand it? Do you really can picture the pathway of this CO2 molecule? How does it really travel and react, right? So here, once again, it's in your red blood cell. Once you picked up the CO2 as the waste product from the tissues of your body, in your red blood cell, reaction A happens, okay? CO2 is converted into bicarbonate, okay? And then the bicarbonate will dissolve in your plasma, okay? And then the plasma travels to your lung. If it's from your toe cells, then they travel all the way from your toe to your lung, right? The veins, right? So through the veins, they travel all the way to your lung, and then in your lung, that they reform CO2 again, and then you exhale it, okay? So it's in the lung that reaction B is happening. Okay, all right, I hope that's clear. Okay, so that's the pathway how CO2 gets to the lung, and eventually you exhale, okay? And then they get to the real beautiful world, okay? All right, so that's one pathway, okay? And then I also said in my introduction that some CO2, they just ride with hemoglobin, okay? And then we know that hemoglobin, they have, usually we think they have great affinity with oxygen, right? Because we learn this way. This is what our professor taught us from the get-go. We know, okay, yeah, but we also CO2 binds with hemoglobin too, okay? Don't neglect that. And then hemoglobin, of course, it's everywhere in your red blood cell, aka in your blood, right? So that they can also travel to your lung through that pathway, okay? And then here, I want to talk a little bit more, okay? I want to show you this graph that it's very high yield on MCAT. It's called Bohr effect, or in other simple words, hemoglobin association dissociation graph, okay? So let's break it down. See how this is related to the second pathway of how CO2 travels to the lung, okay? So this graph is about oxygen's affinity with hemoglobin. But as you can imagine, right? If as I told you, CO2 also binds to hemoglobin. So hemoglobin only has that many spots, right, to bind. I mean, if you can imagine, if CO2 is having high affinity with the hemoglobin, then of course there's no spots for carbon dioxide. So, okay, eventually I'll make this connection again. But now let's analyze this graph, okay? So this graph, the x-axis is the pressure of oxygen, okay? So basically the concentration, I mean, how much oxygen, okay? In simple words. I mean, we can't count, because in a biological system, the reason why we use this weird pressure is because we can't really count how many oxygen molecules, right? But we can always measure the pressure because oxygen is a gas, okay? So x-axis is the pressure of oxygen, basically concentration of oxygen, okay? And then y-axis is the hemoglobin saturation, meaning what? Meaning saturated means like all the spots are filled, right? And then we also say enzyme saturation is like the active site is fully occupied, whatever. Remember the enzyme kinetic graph? Okay, I don't want to further elaborate. Okay, so let's go back to our graph. So hemoglobin saturation means how like your hemoglobin spots for binding oxygen and is occupied, right? If it's fully occupied, then fully saturated. Okay, all right, so this black line in the middle, this is the normal situation, okay? In normal situation, okay, when I have like a ton of CO2 pressure, means I have a ton of, O2. When I have a ton of O2, then you see, oh, my saturation rate is pretty high, right? Whereas when I have low oxygen concentration, then pretty low saturation. That makes sense, right? You don't have that much amount. How do you saturate the hemoglobin, right? Okay, so this is the graph, okay? And then according to our different biological phenomena, our body reacts differently, right? So sometimes, for example, when we exercise, our body temperature, please see here, our body temperature will increase, right? And then our CO2 level will increase, okay? Why? Because a ton of cellular respiration is happening when you exercise, right? Even though sometimes cellular respiration doesn't get to the last stage of oxidative phosphorylation, but still glycolysis is happening. And then also the what's it called? Lactic acid fermentation is happening, especially when you're exercising, right? So that pyruvate gets oxidized reduced to lactate acid, right? So that will at the same time oxidize the NADH to NAD+, right? So that you will also have proton produced. You will also have proton produced when you are exercising, when you're doing lactic acid fermentation, right? So this is all like the biological, physiological responses of your body, okay? And then once you have those phenomena, and then also one more phenomenon is the 2,3 DPG, that increases because it's an intermediate of glycolysis. Of course, when you're exercising, when you're feeling so warm, right, a lot of the glycolysis activity is happening, right? So all these phenomena, biological phenomena would tell the body, okay, now I have to decrease my oxygen affinity. Why? Because your body needs oxygen. So I'm going to decrease the affinity so that hemoglobin can kind of undisassociate with the oxygen, so the oxygens can be dropped off to your tissues, especially from the example I discussed, the muscle tissues, right? Okay, so what does that tell you? That tells you when a graph shifts to the right is when the oxygen affinity decreases. And then that means what? That means your CO2 now have the chance to bind to hemoglobin and go to the lungs, right? So this is really where this second pathway of CO2 traveling to lung, that is related, okay? Okay, now let's look at the other line that's shifting to the left, okay? Then the shifting left, I just flipped everything, right? I said, okay, here I said temperature increase, CO2 increase, proton increase, pH decrease, right? And then this 2,3 DPG increases, but here everything is flipped, right? Temperature decrease. Let's say you went to northern Canada, right? Okay, your temperature decrease, your CO2 level decrease, your proton level decrease, your pH level increase, this glycolysis intermediate decrease, and then the oxygen affinity would increase, right? Would increase. Now you don't have the chance to do the step 2, okay? And then that's when the graph shifts to the left, okay? So this is really an important graph in terms of oxygen's affinity with with the hemoglobin, but I'm just mentioning this here. It's kind of related to carbon dioxide. I know the topic is carbon dioxide, but you get my logic, okay? All right. So, and also one more thing is that the fetal hemoglobin has a very, very strong affinity with oxygen because they just have different structure, okay? I mean, the fetal hemoglobin has a different structure than the adult hemoglobin. Okay, perfect. So that's the two pathways that I introduced how CO2 travels from the tissues to the lungs and then eventually gets exhaled, right? And then also, like I said, the third pathway is very small amount of CO2, like 7% of them. They're the good ones, okay? They just dissolve after your blood picks up the CO2. They just dissolve in the plasma and then it gets all the way to your lungs, okay? I hope that's helpful.